At the end of our last lecture, we finished up with the conclusion of the Second World War. But very much like the end of the First World War, the question is, what is this post-war world going to be? Well, even during the war, the Allies attempted to hammer out that amongst themselves. What was this post-war world going to look like when the Empire of Japan, Mussolini's Italy, and Hitler's Third Reich were no more? What were we going to do? What were we going to put in its place? As early as 1941, Franklin Delano Roosevelt and Winston Churchill met to hammer out the Atlantic Charter. This was a broad outline of principles that would form the basis of the Allied pursuit of peace. These broad principles committing themselves to a pursuit of freedom. In many ways, you could look at the Atlantic Charter and compare it to, in some regards, the 14 points, this broad, philosophical, principled idea as to what the post-war world should look like. But the nitty-gritty details of the post-war period were going to be settled at two main war conferences, the Yalta Conference and the Potsdam Conference. And at these conferences, the Allies attempted to settle a number of interrelated issues. First, what were the reparations owed to the Soviet Union? They, the country who suffered so much and so devastatingly. Second, what was going to be the nature of the occupation of Germany? What was the post-war position of it? Third, what was going to be the definition of Soviet influence in Eastern Europe? Stalin certainly was making waves that he was not prepared to let Eastern Europe simply go its own way, given that this would make a second invasion that had come from Germany through the corridor of Eastern Europe into Russia. He wanted to have a strong position in that region. And then lastly, as the armies had advanced and closed the noose, if you will, around the Nazi Reich, they had come face to face with the true horrors of the Nazi regime, the Holocaust. And as they had also dealt with the Japanese in the Pacific, the British and the French and the Americans are coming to grips with the horrors of the Japanese regime as well. And so a last question was, how are we going to deal with functionally war criminals, those who needed to be prosecuted and brought to justice after this conflict? So a multifaceted attempt to solve these interrelated issues that while these conferences were met with much acclaim, very quickly thereafter we realize that the conferences didn't accomplish as much as everyone hoped. Because the conferences laid out agreements for the post-war division of Europe, or post-war division of Germany, but very quickly you started to see tensions emerging amid the formerly powerful and formerly friendly allies. Now, initially, one of the elements that caused friction was the U.S. attempted to buttress and build up Western Europe. They announced this through what was known as the Marshall Plan, a massive commitment of millions of dollars of aid to Western Europe to help them recover. The aid was not simply money, it included things like tractors, it included seeds. The goal was to try and help a devastated Europe recover. The problem was this started to get very quickly enmeshed with politics. The Soviet Union saw this aid as a political threat because the Marshall Plan originally was intended to go to nearly anyone who asked for it, including the Soviet Union and Eastern Europe. The problem is the Soviets saw this as a threat. They believed that the Marshall Plan was actually sort of a form of economic warfare. The U.S. was trying to politically influence the Soviet Union and Eastern Europe through this aid. And so they chose to not accept it, and this meant the Marshall Plan in total went to Western Europe. And this Marshall Plan was critical not only in rebuilding the economies of the states of Western Europe, it also put a particular stamp on the states of Western Europe. It helped Europe create the modern welfare state. In the post-World War II period, the welfare state involved a shift in the purpose of the state. The state went from simply being concerned with politics and military affairs to being actively committed to dealing with and helping the welfare of its citizens. These often examples of the welfare state in the immediate post-war period, aided and benefited by the Marshall Plan, was government provisions for education, transportation, especially health care, trying to provide health care to all citizens. Probably the best example of this shift in the welfare state is Great Britain's enactment of the National Health Service, a government-run healthcare system to provide healthcare to all. Now, the Soviets may not have been that far wrong in terms of their belief that the Marshall Plan was signaling a shift in the fortunes of inter-allied cooperation. Because shortly after the Marshall Plan was announced, so was a commitment by President Harry S. Truman to the Truman Doctrine. This was a commitment by the U.S. to aid and support all those who were, it was somewhat vaguely asserted, those who are struggling against political actors in their region, struggling against forces opposed to freedom. Really what this is an announcement that the United States is going to aid those who are resisting communists and communist influence within their countries. And this was part of a shift in U.S. policy towards something known as containment. The goal of the U.S. from the late 40s on was a policy of containment whereby they attempted to contain the Soviet Union and its influence to where it extended presently. This was a focus of U.S. policy to try and contain the Soviet Union within its domain, within its areas of influence, and the active use of force and political influence and economic influence wherever it tried to spread. You can think of this in terms of eventually what will come the war in Korea, the expansion of maybe not even Soviet influence, but communist influence to South Korea. That must be met with force. We must push it back. We must contain it to where it is. And this focus on containment meant more than anything an acceptance of the division of Europe and, if you will, the division of the world itself. This mock-up of the division of Berlin in many ways emulates the division of what is becoming Europe itself. As tensions grow between the superpowers, the United States and the Soviet Union, this division of the world becomes harder and stronger. And unfortunately, the tensions within Europe were only going to get much worse. Germany was divided. The zones of occupation were laid out in the post-war conferences, Potsdam and Yalta. But more than that, the city of Berlin was divided as well, also equally parceled out. But the location of Berlin was significant. Berlin was several hundred miles within the Soviet territory. And this meant that areas of Western control, what would eventually become West Berlin, were within the Soviet zone of occupation. And responding to issues such as the Marshall Plan, the Truman Doctrine, reacting to actions by the Western powers in their areas of occupation of Germany, the Soviets attempted to use Berlin as a pressure point in diplomatic negotiations. And so they cut off, blockaded Berlin. Now, what this meant was they simply cut off road and rail access to the western zones of Berlin. They hoped that by doing this, they would force the British, the French, and the Americans to the negotiation table, address some of the Soviet concerns, but the Allies responded, specifically the United States, in a much different way. They realized that there was one area in which the Soviets could not blockade. That was, simply put, the air. And the U.S. committed themselves to a massive airlift in order to provide the fuel and food and medical supplies needed to sustain the people of West Berlin despite this blockade. And this was a massive commitment of resources. This was an air operation that was seeing hundreds and thousands of planes being flown in every single day. And this occurred for over 14 months. And so you're talking about a massive commitment of resources. Eventually the Soviets are forced to back down, but more than anything this showcases that Europe is being divided. Europe is being cut between the superpowers. The eventual Iron Curtain and division of Europe, something that we're so familiar with, is being formed in this immediate post-war period. All these squabbles, all these periods of tension are simply further dividing the Soviet Union from their former allies and making people believe that there is no way that this is not an iron curtain, there is no way this is not an iron divide between Western and Eastern Europe. And so you're getting a solidification, if you will, of power blocks and associated powers on the side of their respective superpower. As tensions got worse, there seemed to be a glimmer of an opportunity for a chance to pull back from where things had gone. And that's namely, Joseph Stalin dies in 1954, and a new leader, Nikita Khrushchev, comes to power. And initially it seems like there might be a chance for Khrushchev to lead the Soviet Union and the United States towards a period of reconciliation and at least a lessening of some of the, is now is known as the Cold War, lessening of Cold War tensions. And there's a couple examples of what Khrushchev is doing that suggests that he wants a new type of relationship with the West. When he comes to power, he champions a policy of de-Stalinization. This is a policy in which he released prisoners from the Gulag. This is a period in which he exposes publicly the crimes, if you will, of Stalin, of his use of the Gulag, of the purges, of his use of the secret police, and an attempt to publicly decry and admit the crimes of Stalin. It's also during this period that Khrushchev declares that he wanted a foreign policy of peaceful coexistence with the United States, that he wants to find a way for the U.S. and the Soviet Union to peacefully coexist. But if there was a glimmer of hope, things start to turn worse. So worse, in fact, that we reach a crisis that most people believe is the closest we ever came to nuclear war and World War III. Namely, as we enter the 1960s, Nikita Khrushchev starts to clash with his opposite superpower leader, President John F. Kennedy. Khrushchev doesn't believe that Kennedy is that strong of a leader and starts to believe that he can push Kennedy around. An example of this is that Khrushchev, under his rule, you see the further division of Germany by the erection of the Berlin Wall. West Berlin had, unfortunately for the East German government, the Soviet-backed communist government of East Germany, turned into a loophole by which all of those who were upset with the East German government, those who did not like living under a communist government, could easily and quickly flee to West Berlin, and by extension they could flee to Western Europe, West Germany, and escape the communists. And this is leading to a huge drain in East German society and economic productivity and economics, mostly because the people who are seizing this opportunity to flee the country are often the best and brightest of the East German society. So this is very much a brain drain. And while the East German government had attempted to stop people from being able to get out before, they realized more drastic action was needed. And thus they erect a wall around the entirety of West Berlin, isolating it and largely preventing their own people from accessing West Berlin. Now, they claim this is actually a defensive wall. They actually call it an anti-fascist protective rampart in nice Cold War lingo. But really it's a wall to prevent their citizens from being able to flee. And when Kennedy does nothing about this, the U.S. doesn't intervene, the U.S. doesn't bring in bulldozers and knock down this wall, this further convinces Khrushchev that perhaps Kennedy, who, yes, comes to Berlin and makes a speech about, West Berliners are the people of freedom, and ich bin ein Berliner, I am a Berliner like you, he's not really going to resist what the Soviets want to do. And so this sort of assessment of Kennedy is what leads to the Cuban Missile Crisis. In an attempt to stabilize the regime of Fidel Castro, as well as to protect the communist Cuba from the state of communist Cuba from a threatened invasion by the United States, Khrushchev starts trying to erect nuclear missiles in Cuba. And this will be a way to protect the Cuban communists from any future American invasion. Unfortunately, the U.S. are able to gain photos of the construction, recognize that the Soviets still have more components to ship before they can stand up these missiles, and the war watches as we nearly come to the brink of war. Kennedy initiates a quarantine of the Cuban mainland, saying that he will stop any Soviet ships that come, knowing that they're bringing components to let these missiles finally be stood up. And as the Soviet ships get closer and closer to the quarantine line, most of the rest of the world watches with bated breath to see if the world is going to blow itself up. Thankfully, cooler heads and diplomacy behind the scenes occur, and this leads to a secret negotiation whereby the Soviets pull out the missiles, as do the Americans from their bases in Turkey, which, if you look at a map, is functionally like putting missiles in Cuba, so sort of a tit-for-tat arrangement, and thus the world pulls back from the brink of war. And so this at least preserves peace, but creates, if you will, the conditions to help assess the rest of Europe. Because this near-death experience for the entire globe, this shadow, if you will, of nuclear holocaust, that's going to hang over Europe and is going to help make sense of the cultural and other developments that occur precisely because it does so in the shadow of the nuclear bomb.